The illusion of victory. In the early winter of 1944, a German officer wrote about the American paratroopers at Bastogne. He said they fought like something that had decided not to die. 6 years later, and 5,000 miles away, another empire would learn that exact same lesson. But this time, it would not happen in the frozen forests of Europe. It would happen in the razor-sharp, wind-blasted peaks of North Korea. In December of 1950, General Funchilin, the commander of the Chinese 9th Army Corps, sat in a dimly lit, makeshift command bunker. Outside, the Siberian winds screamed through the mountain passes near the Chosin Reservoir. The temperature had dropped to minus 35 degrees Celsius. Funchilin was a veteran of the Long March. He understood suffering. He understood how to move armies through impossible terrain without being detected. For weeks, he had marched 120,000 Chinese soldiers through the mountains under the cover of total darkness. They carried no heavy artillery, no supply trains, and no tents. They lived on frozen turnips and a handful of parched grain. They slept in the open snow, dynamic shadows moving through a white hell. Their target was the 1st Marine Division of the United States Army. To the Chinese High Command, the Americans looked like an army of spoiled children. They were a rich nation's boys. They traveled in heated trucks. They expected hot meals. They relied on massive air support and heavy artillery. Funchilin believed that if you stripped away their machines, if you cut them off from their supplies and forced them into the freezing dark, they would crumble. He had built the perfect tactical trap. The 1st Marine Division, along with elements of the U.S. 7th Infantry Division, roughly 30,000 men, had been lured deep into the mountains along a single, narrow dirt road. It was a primitive track, barely wide enough for a single truck, winding through sheer cliffs and bottomless gorges. Funchilin had deployed his 120,000 men along the ridges overlooking this road. They had the high ground. They had the numbers, 4-1. They had the element of total surprise. On the night of November 27th, Funchilin gave the order. The trap was sprung. The attack did not begin with the roar of artillery. It began with the sound of brass horns, wooden whistles, and gongs echoing through the frozen canyons. To the young Marines shivering in their sleeping bags, the sound was haunting. It felt ancient, tribal, and terrifying. Out of the pitch black, thousands of Chinese soldiers emerged from the snow. Many of them were wearing nothing but thin, white cotton uniforms for camouflage. They didn't shout. They moved in a disciplined, eerie silence, firing their rifles and throwing stick grenades into the American tents. Within hours, the single road was severed in multiple places. The Marine units were broken into isolated pockets of resistance, stretched out over a 30-mile line. They were completely cut off from each other. No supplies could get in. No wounded could get out. In Peking, the communist leadership waited for the news of a total massacre. By all laws of military science, the 1st Marine Division was already dead. They were surrounded, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and freezing to death. But Funchilin did not get his quick victory. When the sun rose over the jagged peaks on November 28th, the Chinese commanders looked down through their binoculars and saw something they did not expect. The Americans were not panicking. They were not running. Wherever a group of Marines had been cut off, they had dug their boots into the frozen earth and formed a circle. Major General Oliver P. Smith, the quiet, scholarly commander of the 1st Marine Division, looked at the maps in his command post at Hagaruri. The situation was catastrophic. When a British journalist managed to reach him and asked if the Marines were retreating, Smith looked at him with cold, steady eyes. He said, "Retreat? Hell, we're just attacking in another direction." This wasn't a boast. It was a literal, brutal statement of operational reality. The Marines had no rear guard. There was no safe zone to run to. The only way out was to turn around and fight their way through 70 miles of mountains, destroying every Chinese division that stood in their path. By the 3rd day, the battle had become something worse than a war. It became a test of absolute human endurance. The cold became an active combatant, striking both sides with equal, merciless fury. The temperature dropped so low that human blood froze instantly upon contact with the air. Men who were shot did not bleed out. The cold coagulated their wounds, saving their lives in the short term, only for frostbite to claim their limbs later. Medical corpsmen found themselves helpless. The morphine syringes were frozen solid. They had to keep the medicine inside their mouths, using their own body heat to melt it before they could inject a dying Marine. The plasma bottles froze and shattered. If a medic tried to apply a wet field dressing to a wound, it turned to ice within seconds, tearing the flesh away when removed. The machines failed first. The oil in the engines of the trucks and tanks turned to a thick, useless sludge. The Americans had to keep their vehicles running 24 hours a day because if an engine stopped once, it would never start again. The springs in the M1 Garand rifles grew brittle and snapped. The firing pins on the machine guns failed to strike. Marines discovered that the standard military grease had turned to glue. They had to strip their weapons entirely bare, cleaning away all lubrication and pee on the bolts just to keep the metal moving. But if the Americans were suffering, the Chinese were experiencing an apocalypse. They had no winter gear at all. Their canvas sneakers froze to their feet. Thousands of Funchilin's men suffered from third-degree frostbite before they even fired a single shot. A captured Chinese diary from the 59th Division contained this entry. "The cold is stealing our men. Yesterday, my squad had 12 soldiers. Tonight, 5 cannot move their legs. 2 did not wake up from the snow. We have no wood for fires because the smoke brings the enemy planes. We eat the snow to stay alive, but it burns our throats." Yet, despite the agony, the Chinese soldiers kept coming. They were driven by an iron discipline and a political fervor that shocked the Western analytical mind. They attacked in human waves, stepping over the frozen bodies of their comrades, rushing directly into the mouths of American machine guns. To understand what broke the spirit of the Chinese army, you have to look at a single isolated hill along the road. It was called Funchilin Pass, guarded by a lone formation, Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. There were 234 men commanded by a rugged captain named William Barber. Their mission was simple but suicidal. They had to hold the pass. If the Chinese took Fox Hill, they would control the high ground overlooking the main escape route, and the entire Marine division would be trapped and slaughtered in the valley below. For 5 consecutive nights, an entire Chinese regiment of over 360 men assaulted Fox Hill. They attacked from 3 sides in the middle of raging blizzards. The fighting was so close that men were killing each other with bayonets, knives, and the heavy iron heels of their boots. Captain Barber was shot through the leg, but he refused to be evacuated. He crawled from foxhole to foxhole, dragging himself through the bloody snow, directing his men. When his machine gunners were killed, cook and radio operators took their places. By the 4th night, Fox Company was completely out of ammunition. They began to use captured Chinese grenades and rifles. When those ran out, they dug up the frozen corpses of the enemy and rolled them down the hill to trip the oncoming waves of attackers. On the 5th morning, a relief column finally broke through to Fox Hill. Out of the 234 men who had climbed that hill 5 days earlier, only 82 walked down on their own power. The rest were wounded or dead. But the pass was still open. Surrounding Fox Hill were the frozen bodies of over 1,000 Chinese soldiers. An officer from the relief column wrote, "When we reached Barber's lines, the men didn't celebrate. They were silent. They looked like ghosts covered in white frost, but their weapons were clean, and they were still facing the enemy." As the columns of the 1st Marine Division began their agonizing march south toward the sea, the Chinese staff officers began to notice a psychological shift in their own ranks. The Chinese military doctrine was built on the concept of revolutionary supremacy. They believed that a highly motivated infantry force, willing to sacrifice everything, could always defeat a materialistic, technological army. But at Chosin, they encountered an enemy that matched their fanaticism, but possessed a terrifying level of logistical cohesion. The Marines refused to behave like a defeated army. In conventional warfare, when an army is retreating through an enemy-held canyon, they abandon their heavy gear, they throw away their trucks, they leave their dead, and they scatter into the hills to save themselves. The Marines did none of this. They marched in perfect tactical formation. They kept their tanks at the front and the rear of the column. And most disturbingly to the Chinese observers, they brought their dead with them. A Chinese tactical assessment captured later by UN forces, noted this with a sense of grim wonder. The enemy possesses a strange, religious attachment to their fallen. They do not leave a single body behind. They place their dead on the hoods of their vehicles, covered in blankets. They will halt an entire armored column under heavy mortar fire just to retrieve a wounded soldier from a ridge. This behavior is irrational, yet it gives their troops an unbreakable sense of security. Every man knows that no matter what happens, his comrades will come for him. This loyalty created a collective psychological wall. The individual Marine didn't have to worry about being abandoned in the ice to die alone. That fear was removed from his mind, and a soldier without fear of abandonment is a very dangerous animal. By December 6th, the Marines had fought their way to a deep, jagged gorge at Funchilin Pass. This was the final gate. If they passed this point, they would break out of the mountains and into the coastal plains, where the US Navy was waiting to evacuate them. But Funchilin knew this. He had anticipated their route. He sent a specialized demolition squad deep into the pass, and they completely destroyed the single concrete bridge spanning the chasm. There was no way around it. To the left was a sheer rock wall rising hundreds of feet into the sky. To the right was a drop of several thousand feet into a rocky abyss. The gap was 29 feet wide. Without a bridge, every vehicle, every tank, every ambulance carrying thousands of frostbitten, screaming wounded men would have to be abandoned. The Marines would be forced to climb down into the canyon on foot, unarmed, leaving all their strength behind. Funchilin moved his remaining divisions into position on the heights surrounding the blown bridge. He prepared for the final execution. What happened next is still studied as one of the greatest logistical miracles in military history. The Marines didn't give up. They radioed the Combat Cargo Command. On the morning of December 7th, massive twin-engine C-119 flying boxcars roared over the canyon. From their cargo bays, they dropped 8 giant, 2.5-ton steel treadway bridge sections. They came down on massive billowing parachutes. One section landed in enemy territory. One section was damaged on the rocks. But 6 sections landed safely inside the tiny Marine perimeter. Working in a blinding snowstorm, under direct enemy machine gun fire, with fingers so frozen they couldn't feel the bolts they were turning, the Marine Corps engineers went to work. They used timber, sandbags, and raw muscle. In less than 24 hours, they built a steel bridge across a bottomless abyss in the middle of a sub-zero wilderness. When the Chinese soldiers on the cliffs looked through the snow and saw the first 30-ton M26 Pershing tank slowly rumble across that makeshift steel bridge, something broke inside them. It wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a spiritual defeat. They realized they were fighting an army that could literally drop a highway out of the sky. A Chinese company commander, who survived the battle and later defected, wrote, "We had done everything right. We had frozen for weeks. We had died by the thousands to destroy that bridge. And then, they simply made a new one from the air." I looked at my men. Their hands were black from frostbite. Their guns were empty. I knew then that we could never destroy them. They had resources we couldn't even imagine. But more than that, they had a terrifying, stubborn will to survive. On December 11th, the first elements of the 1st Marine Division walked out of the mountains and into the port city of Hungnam. The civilian workers and the naval officers who stood on the docks to receive them fell completely silent as the column approached. The men didn't look like human beings. Their faces were blackened by frostbite and engine grease. Their clothes were shredded, stiff with dried blood and ice. Their eyebrows and beards were caked with thick white rime. Many of them were walking on feet that had turned completely black from gangrene. But they walked in step. They carried their rifles, and behind them in a long, quiet line of trucks came the bodies of every single Marine who had fallen in the valley. The 1st Marine Division had broken through 7 Chinese divisions. They had sustained nearly 8,000 casualties from combat and another 8,000 from the cold. But they were still an army, they were still a division. The Chinese 9th Army Corps was finished. Out of 120,000 men, Funchilin had lost over 40,000. Some historians estimate the number was closer to 50,000. The elite force that Mao Zedong had sent to win the war had been turned into an army of cripples and corpses in the snows of Chosin. It would take them nearly 5 months of resting and rebuilding before they could ever take the field again. General Funchilin would survive the war. He would live to be an old man, a highly respected military mind in the new China. But those who knew him after 1950 said he never spoke of the Chosin Reservoir without a long, heavy silence. In his official memoirs, published decades later, the language is dry and bureaucratic. But in his private conversations with his staff officers, he used a different tone. He admitted that he had brought everything the revolutionary doctrine demanded. He had brought sacrifice, surprise, and numbers. But it didn't work. Because his opponent had chosen an option that no military manual had ever accounted for. They simply decided not to die